All right, kicking off another show, Zen and Callsigns. I have a great guest today, Dr. Tara Deliberto. Did I pronounce that right? I was trying.
Yeah. Yeah, that was great.
All
Yeah.
right. Thanks so much for being with me this evening. How are you?
I'm doing great, Blake. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's so important to talk about both mental health and how to raise consciousness. So I'm really delighted to be here with you tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I think your background and the work you're doing right now is what is needed in our world. So, and I think you're kind of on the edge of executing that in the U.S. and throughout the world, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I'd love for you to start a little bit about your background, where you're from, kind of way back then, maybe 20 something years ago. If you kind of start from there, and we'll riff to present day, and you have the floor.
Wonderful, Blake. Thanks so much. I'm Dr. Tara Deliberto. My background is in clinical psychology, and I was on faculty at Cornell University's medical college called Weill Cornell Medicine, where I opened and directed a program for eating disorders for a period of time and wrote this book that I happen to have here called Treating Eating Disorders in Adolescence, which is a full stack treatment to help people, adolescents and adults as well, recover from eating disorders. And prior to that work at Cornell, as you mentioned, 20 years ago, Blake, I was managing a lab at Harvard University that studied suicide and self injury, which is a really important topic that impacts so many people worldwide. And now, present day, 20 years later, my work is really on raising consciousness. It's more in the spirituality space, but there's so much to be learned, whether a person is struggling with these existential questions of wanting to live or not. There's so much to be learned there and taught there. And
Yeah.
so much to be learned about how to get out of programming that we have, such as eating disorder programming, that we need to look a certain way. And all of this pertains to how we can raise consciousness generally with meditation in the context of spirituality, etc. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, and I'm excited to dive
Yeah.
in.
So when you were getting your Bachelor of Science in Psychology at Boston University, did you think you'd kind of be doing this work you're doing right now?
What a good question. I had no idea what I signed up for. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I was studying abroad in Sydney, Australia, and my roommate was really interested in psychological research. And she was working at
Hmm.
Macquarie University down in Sydney.
Yeah.
And she would come home and I'd pick her brain about what she was doing. And I wanted to know about all the studies. And I had a million questions and I was fascinated with the work she was doing. And she said, Tara, I think that you should become a psychologist. Maybe you can get a job in a lab. I mean, if you're so interested in this. And I thought, yeah, okay. And so I reached out to a bunch of different faculty members across the Boston, Cambridge area. And the very first person that responded was Dr. Matthew Knock, who was at Harvard University. He's now tenured. He actually has a MacArthur Fellowship, which is also known as a Genius Award, and he's done amazing work in suicide and self injury. But he had just joined the faculty. He was fresh as a professor, and he needed to hire someone and hired me. So I came, and my whole last year at Boston University, I worked for him, getting course credit. I think I was working about 30 hours a week there in his lab, managing studies of suicide, treatment for suicide, and non suicidal self injury. So, cutting, burning without wanting to die. And from there, the rest is history, as they say. I stayed on as a lab manager and went on from there. So, it was really a stroke of luck that if you want to look at it that way, or serendipity, depending upon your
Yeah.
paradigm, that I had a roommate that really encouraged me to go into this field. And the very first person that hired me was essentially the guy that
A
ended up
genius,
going to
right? Yeah.
Florida Sky. Yeah. So it worked out. It worked out for me. And
Yeah.
Matt has been a friend and mentor all these years. And I'm very grateful to him for that.
Cool. Kind of a question on that. Since you've kind of been around and studying people, then they've taken their own life, or people that have been hurting themselves and really struggling with mental health, And I've asked this of Kelly as well, of like, how do you manage when you're around such trauma all the time? How do you manage it yourself? Now, because you're in some ways you're experiencing it, and you're hearing stories, and so how do you manage that type of trauma when you're sitting next to it and experiencing it?
That's a great question. And your wife, Kelly, is such a high level healer. I'm sure she has her own insights into this as well. So, the way that I think about this is that whether or not I personally, Dr. Tara Deliberto, if I'm interfacing with these issues or not, they're happening,
Yeah.
right? People are hurting, they're experiencing trauma, whether or not I'm exposing myself to it. So, if it's going to be happening, I might as well equip myself to the best of my ability to be able to help, and trust that what I'm doing by sitting there and being with that person and using my skills to attempt to help in the situation in some way is enough. So I don't make it about whether I personally can save this person or not. It's not on me. And I can help, and I can be there, and I can really polish my skills and develop them to a really high level so that I can be helpful. And I think that if you take the ego out of the helping, and you can decouple the attachment, or you can decouple the outcome of what happens with a person from you, then
Mm.
it becomes a lot easier to sit and be present with that person and their suffering, and be of service in that way. And that's kind of step one. And step two is, of course, doing the work on yourself. So if you're feeling traumatized by hearing about something that happened to someone, or you start living in fear, then it comes to doing the work for yourself, either going to therapy or using the skills that you teach to make sure that you are feeling safe in the world, safe in your body, and are mindful of your various triggers.
So I like that because it's just kind of removing yourself to a little degree. To kind of riff on that still. So what's your like kind of philosophical operating system? How do you work exactly from that side?
Ooh, I like this question. Nobody's ever asked me this question. It's so good. Okay. So when I first became a psychologist, I was a stone cold atheist, and I didn't believe in
Hmm.
anything outside of myself, and I still wanted to serve. And through that process of serving and connecting and overcoming my own fears about not being good enough and my own fears
Hmm.
about the world being unsafe, I started to connect more and more with, we'll say, my intuition or my higher self, my true self, my soul. And at some point, I had a paradigm shift from being an atheist person that wanted to help, to having more spiritual experiences at higher states of consciousness, even being in bliss states for extended periods of time, and integrating those in such a way that provided a different perspective. We'll say a more, relatively speaking, non-dual perspective. So rather than seeing things as
Sure.
good or bad,
Right.
life and death, seeing things in a much more process oriented way, and not really thinking in terms of good or bad, thinking about life as unfolding and being reverent of the process, and how, we'll say, even God, I feel comfortable saying that word now. I didn't always, but how God
Yeah.
works in ways that I, in my avatar, cannot understand. And so I think that reverence and acceptance and compassion are more of the qualities of the paradigm that I'm functioning from now. So I'd say I really operate from what can be considered a spiritual perspective now.
Does that still take into account like kind of the Jungian ideals, or no? How do you look at that?
Oh, that's right. I forgot that you were a young fan. I'm remembering now. We had a great conversation in California when you lived here about that.
Yeah.
Um, you know, You probably know Young more than I do, to be honest. I might have a PhD in
Maybe, I doubt
psychology.
it, but
No, I actually don't. I bet you do. Um, I happen to have a PhD in psychology, but what people are taught really in modern day psychology is behavioral theory, and mindfulness, etc. But really, the Jungian perspective and the collective consciousness was not anything that I had been exposed to
interesting.
in graduate school at all. So
Wow.
everything that I learned about Jung, other than basically his name and maybe some titles of books that he wrote, I
Yeah,
learned after getting my
that is
PhD.
interesting.
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? And I actually learned about Jung after leaving my faculty position at Cornell. That's when I really dove headlong into Jung and started understanding things a bit more. So I do think that I operate from a Jungian perspective now in some ways in my clinical work, but the mechanisms of what I'm doing in my clinical work with my patients is still very behavioral. I do want to move the needle in an outcome based way from, we'll say, a person having a body in the underweight range to a body that is healthy for their genetic makeup. And so I am concerned with, to some extent, the bottom line of helping my patients move into healthier bodies in my eating disorder work. And at the same time, I am in my personal life and also my professional life operating with this spiritual perspective as well. So I think
Yeah.
it's both that I am behaviorist in my approach and also quite Jungian and spiritual in my philosophical contextualizing and conceptualizing.
Yeah, so I had kind of two questions from there. So going through from undergrad to PhD, is that, how many years was that total time
See?
in academia about?
Yeah, it's a lot. Okay, so let's do the math. Um,
Okay.
so 4 years in undergrad, then 2 years working for Matt Nakas as lab manager at Harvard, then 6 years of a PhD, so that's 12, and then an additional 2 years of postdoc at Cornell, so that's 14 years, and then an additional several years as a professor at Cornell after my postdoc. So I think it probably is about 17 years in academia.
A lot of people, lots of different people would say how academia today maybe is a dogma, and they're not solving problems, certainly on the physics front, mathematics. Would you say that that's similar in the psychology and psychiatry front?
This is a good question. I'm going to say it.
Well,
I'm
I
just going to
only
do
want to
it.
have good
Right?
questions.
Yeah, yeah. It's just us, right? Nobody's going to see this other than us. No,
And
this
I'm
is a
not trying to, I've
right.
gotcha. It's more of like, hey, what's the balance? The academics are trying, yeah, hey, they're trying to solve problems, and they're with metrics and seeing if they're working. And so I just think it's interesting juxtaposition to see how you're shifting into this spiritual side, and how you've described of stone cold atheist to now of like, oh, there's this source, something is, this is there. So that's why I kind of asked that. But
Oh,
also
you don't need to
many people
justify it.
describe it.
I
Yeah.
yeah, I just evaded the question. But I'm going to answer it really specifically. Okay.
All right.
Yes. Yes, I do believe that academia is really dogmatic and is maybe not moving the dial. So I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but I was talking to an old mentor of mine. Actually, he'll remain nameless. And, by
All
all
right.
outward measures of success, this person has gone very far in academia. And yet, certain rates of disorders stay the same. So, for instance,
Yeah.
suicide, which is not a disorder but a behavior, but the suicide rate has remained the same. And so we can do all of this research, but if we're not helping people to recover or learn skills or getting the information out and disseminating treatments, then what are we doing? And so we can
Right.
generate a lot of information in academia that is helpful, but if the
Yeah.
systems are
Yeah.
broken, then what are we going to do? So I'm personally really interested in collaborating with this AI company to develop protocols to help create these AI agents that work as therapists to help people across the world. Because in a few short months, probably, all of this will be completed and then translated into every language on the planet and easily accessible right from your phone. So I really am interested in getting all of this information out of academia and into the world. Now, that's one way of answering the question. The other way of answering the question is about the dogma piece. So
Yeah.
there's, are we doing anything in academia by publishing studies? Yes, no, but we can do more. And is it very dogmatic? Yes. I don't know if there was a real space for me in academia to discuss my spiritual experiences that I started
Hmm.
having. And for instance,
Yeah.
20 years ago, I was interested in biofeedback. So using technology to give us information about what's going on physiologically with the body so that we can change it, for instance. So maybe I'm getting information that my heart is beating really fast and I can use mindfulness practices to slow it down using biofeedback. That was super
Exactly.
interesting to
Yeah.
me, right? But I was told this is career suicide to study something so woo woo. So I dropped it,
Really?
right? So
How is that woo woo when you have like, that's like data? Like, how did that, that's interesting. Okay. Sorry to interrupt, but that's just interesting.
no, it's a
Wow.
good point. 20 years ago,
Hmm.
this is where we were. Now we're
I
much
see.
better. We're at the beginning of the second psychedelic revolution in this country, in America, right? And people are really interested in
Yep.
experimenting with psilocybin, ketamine, ayahuasca, et cetera. And so these atheist academics who were indoctrinated to believe that the 3D world is all of there is and that we have to be very behavioral are going to places like Peru, meeting shamans and getting other perspectives and coming back into the
Right. Yeah.
lab, right? With these experiences at higher states of consciousness and being more open. So I think that we are at the fore of a very interesting dual revolution. One, which is in AI to get all of the information out there, and two, in consciousness and raising consciousness. So
Yeah.
I think that although my experience of academia was that it was pretty dogmatic and limiting, now I'm out and I'm exploring all of these various ways of helping people out of mental health issues and expanding consciousness.
So, what broke you out into this side of spirituality? Did you have a culminating moment or something happen?
Yeah, it's pretty dramatic. It was one of these stories where I literally saw the light, which I realize is
Oh,
not a figure of speech now, but
cool.
an actual phenomenon. It was one of these stories that are pretty common in the spiritual space in some ways. But my particular story is that I had just finished this book, Treating Eating Disorders in Adolescence. I had figured out how to help people with this treatment move from an ideal of thinness, which is rooted in
Hmm.
ego and fear of not being good enough, and the outcome of losing weight, to a higher consciousness ideal of lovingly nourishing the body while accepting the way that it looks, which is process oriented, love based, compassion based, truth based. And so I
Yeah.
thought to myself, well, I just finished this book. I understand this process, but thinness isn't the only egoic ideal that we struggle with. We struggle
Yeah.
with egoic ideals of wealth, fame, even other ideals like being liked by everybody or not causing problems, being a peacemaker all the time, right? This kind of a thing. And I thought, all right, well, I could generalize this process to help people get out of these egoic ideals and into love, truth, and service ideals. Now, it
Yeah.
sounds very spiritual, but for me, it was just very pragmatic. I thought, okay, I know how much freer I am after liberating myself from the thinness ideal, which I had because I was a ballet dancer when I was younger, lived in New York, got lots of
Yeah.
attention for the way that I looked at a certain point, etc. And so I had
Yeah.
been programmed by the outside world to think that I needed my body to look a certain way and it needed to weigh a certain amount. And that was so limiting and fear based and compulsive and horrible. And so when I was able to
Can I
untangle,
ask
oh,
about
please, yeah.
something right there? Because I was, so where does that, because I think that women, it's more prone for women. Is that right? Like of the losing weight. Is that correct?
Well, this is my thinking on this, Blake, and I'm pretty sure this is substantiated by the research, but this is my hot take on the issue personally, right? So
Yeah.
women are subjected in our Western society to lots of commentary all the time about body
I
size,
see.
shape,
Yeah.
and weight. And our worth as women can be measured by some people who are objectifying us and not seeing who we
Men.
are and recognizing our consciousness
Yeah.
states, et cetera, right? Like
Yeah.
we can be objectified by the outside world based on what we look like. And we get a lot of that messaging and a lot of that programming. So women get
I
a
see.
lot
Yeah.
of this programming in this society about thinness, and men also get programming to think about women
Mm.
as objects in this way, and to measure their worth on thinness and based on thinness, and also they also get programming to objectify themselves, right? The way they look, how much muscle mass they have,
Yeah.
their body fat
Sure.
percentage, how much they can lift, right? So, for the
Yep.
most part, women can be indoctrinated to believe that thinness is the ideal for them. Sometimes they have other ideals like slim, thick, or maybe muscular. And the same for men. So some
Sure.
men might have a thinness ideal, etc. But for the most part, it could be a muscularity ideal or like a height
Sure.
ideal, right?
But
To be taller.
yeah, it seems more for that thin ideal more
Mhm.
detrimental to young women, where that's
Yeah.
not for, my, I have daughters and a son, and my son is like not a, he's like just going through, maybe probably like your son too, where he's like,
Yeah.
he doesn't care about that stuff
You're
yet,
right.
or those things. But and so my question there is that nature versus nurture, is that a thing that develops in younger girls, women, where they hear these, right? They're maybe not directly at them, like, a father figure, whoever is like telling them, get, but it's just they see, they observe, they feel all these different, whichever TV or whatever, and they see how, the ballerina, as you said, or somebody's objectified, to be like, hey, that's the ultimate body, or something like that, where they hear it enough, and then it becomes like a like law of primacy or something imprinted in their brain, where they're like, that's, my dad said something like that, right? Offhand, or so, whatever, seemingly innocent, but then and then they kind of follow into this path. So I guess that's kind of open ended there, but is it something like that, of how women then get imprinted, or how would you describe that?
Yeah, I use the word programmed. So
Okay,
they get this
programmed. That's
direct,
better.
so my verbiage, but I think that people get direct messages. You need a way X, right? It could be really
Hmm.
direct, and it also could be indirect. Someone commenting about their own body, for instance, saying, "Oh, I look so fat," and then somebody else is hearing that, thinking, "Well, I'm bigger than that person, or my body's bigger than that person,"
Yeah.
right? So they get these indirect messages, and then also there's all this reinforcement. So people will comment and say, "Oh, you look great. Did you lose weight?" And a person might have, for instance, just had the flu and lost 10 pounds unintentionally. And now somebody is saying, like, "Oh, you look
Looking
great." It's like, "Oh,
good.
yeah, right." It's like, "Well, what did I eat before? I'm actually sick right now. I need to gain the weight back." Right. So like these things can happen, and we get all of this
Yeah.
messaging, and it actually could be super detrimental, right? So all of a
Yep.
sudden people are thinking, "Oh wow, I'm being judged, and I'm afraid of being judged poorly, or I'm afraid of being abandoned or rejected." And so in order to be judged positively and not abandoned, I'm going to make sure I
Mhm.
keep losing weight or I don't gain weight. And then all of a sudden, boom, a person's living in fear.
Yep.
And in spiritual space, right, we talk about not living in fear and living from love. But we get all of this reinforcement that fuels this fear about not being good enough and having to look a certain way. And so, yes, women get a lot of messaging that their worth is based on how they look. So it can create this frenetic energy. And we have to be really careful about the commenting that we're participating in on other people's bodies, and how we talk
Yeah.
about our own bodies in front of our children and other people, how we're talking about food. Okay, so this is a little interesting spiritual point, right? So are you familiar about the studies that show that when you speak kindly to plants, for instance, they grow better, or that water
Yes.
molecules organize
Yep.
in these ways, right? Okay, PS, I'm just going to tilt my camera back a little. Okay, do you see this plant right here? This
Yes.
plant has been through a lot of trauma. So it fell and it has very little soil. And I was like, oh, I don't know if this plant is going to make it. But it sits right here where I'm doing all of my therapy sessions. And despite having its own trauma, it's growing great because I think that it's
Yeah.
absorbing this
Sure.
positive
Yeah.
energy that's happening, right? The healing energy. And
Yeah.
so I don't know if that's too woo or not, but I mean, studies show it. And so
Well,
if we think
well,
about, oh, yeah,
you said you don't need to say it's woo woo anymore, and I hear you because there are studies that show that hermetically sealed vials like have changed their molecular structure of like whatever is inside them together from vibration and in like it carries. And so yeah, I mean like there's it's no longer woo. I think it's just again not to go over you, but it's like
no,
there.
no,
I guess you can call it woo woo now just because be like, that's bullshit, woo woo, and then that's, then you move on. It's almost like gaslighting or something like that.
it is. So thank you for calling it out, right? Because that's my fear
Yeah.
programming from academia coming out, right? Like, oh, like I have to like qualify that this is
Yeah.
woo. So you just intervention me, right? You turn the tables.
Yeah.
That's
Sorry.
right.
Sorry.
No, no, don't apologize. This is brilliant. No, I needed that. Thank you. And I think we do need to be more forthright about this as scientists and in
Yep.
the field that I'm in, right? That these are the results of the studies, right? We always say as scientists that if studies show something that disprove our beliefs, then we need to accept that because that's the scientific process, right? And
Yeah.
here I am saying, oh, it's woo. No, I need to accept the scientific process. This, right? This is what the results are showing. They're showing that
Yeah.
speaking kindly to plants makes them grow despite trauma. And so to think about it from a food perspective, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
if I ate this plant, it probably would be better than if I ate a plant that was in a home of somebody that had been
Yeah.
abusive, right? Or thinking about it, even further, taking this logically even further. So if I'm sitting and worried about gaining weight, and I'm worried about
Right.
what my body's going to look like if I eat this cookie because maybe my boyfriend will leave me if I gain
Mm.
weight,
Right.
I'm energetically essentially poisoning that food in a sense with my fear,
Yeah.
right? And so then I'm eating food that I believe is going to hurt me in some way. I don't know what that does energetically and physically, but I feel like it's not
Yeah.
good versus, right, this
Right.
this practice of sitting in gratitude for the food and thanking, for instance, the cow for sacrificing its life so that you may eat and have protein and be healthy, and thanking the farmers and thanking the person who prepared it and feeling gratitude that you have the ability to sit and eat this cheeseburger, for instance, or vegan cookie or whatever it is. And then you're energetically infusing this food with gratitude and then ingesting it. It feels like that's a safer bet from a consciousness perspective, but
Right.
right.
That's just like, hey, which one would you rather do? Just be like, I hate this food, or it's easy. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, right?
So
So
we
so
kind of went
we're
on a. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, so just to wrap on the eating disorder piece, right?
Yep.
We're poisoning our minds with fear and programming and our food energetically. Who knows what we're doing to it, right? So it's just basically a downward spiral versus lovingly nourishing the body, deprogramming the mind from these kind of patriarchal ideals where we're objectifying ourselves and paying attention to the fact that other people are objectifying us and trying to outrun it, right? Like we're
Yeah.
just getting rid of all that programming, being grateful for our bodies, being grateful for the food. That's upward spiral stuff right there.
Yes, agreed. And that was kind of the tangent off of where you had your, I guess epiphany, we'll call it. And
Yeah.
I went on a tangent there, but if you would continue, I think as you finished writing your book and your help, like, kind of tell me about like how, can you give me like a quick and dirty of like how deprogramming somebody
Yeah, yeah,
who,
yeah. Sure. So we'll talk about the
how
story
does
and
that work?
deprogramming. So let's close those open tabs that we left open.
All right.
So basically, right, this experience that I had of getting myself out of my own eating pathology and deprogramming myself, I felt so free. And I thought to myself, what if I unhook myself from all these ideals? If I just surrender every egoic ideal, what would happen? So I was thinking about it from a logical, scientific way of wanting to free myself from my ego. And I had no idea what would happen. I just thought I'd be really happy. Like I had
Right. Yeah.
no clue that, all the stuff that saints and sages have been talking about in terms of transcending ego and having mystical experiences and bliss, like that was actually like a real thing. Like I
Yeah.
had no reference, no education, nothing on this. And that was until I started having these experiences at higher states of consciousness. Now, that's not to say that the goal of my work is to have spiritual experiences. That is not the goal. You could take a boatload of drugs and have a spiritual experience. Like
Yeah.
it could be helpful or it could be not. The point is that when we are unhooking ourselves from ego, we feel complete freedom. We are sovereign, really sovereign. We're not running programming, and we can do things to positively impact the world that are beyond our wildest dreams, because our thinking is so third dimensional. But when you're unhooked from ego and you're in these more blissful and integrated and embodied states, then you could start thinking really big in terms of how to help. And you're vibrating out, we'll say, a much more intense frequency that can then affect change in the world in the way that this plant is growing, right? But on
Right.
a massive scale. And you can find other people who are vibing at that frequency, and then you start collaborating and doing things like, for instance, creating an AI tool that helps people with mental health issues in every language, this kind of a thing. And
Yeah.
so the point is not to have spiritual experiences. The point is not to be holier than thou. The point is to be free and of service.
Yes. Well said. And I think that the free mind raises the collective consciousness, period.
That's the point.
Of
Yes. It raises your own consciousness, and in an all ships rise kind of a way, you raise the collective consciousness. And so that's where my work is focused now in some respect, like understanding all of the anchors that keep us tied to the 3D in our ego and in our fear, and how to unhook them. Now, how to do that? The quick and dirty. So you asked for the quick and dirty. I'm like, I'm an
Yeah.
academic.
Yeah.
Like, we don't do that. We
All right.
pontificate, and then we're on a soapbox and we go on and on. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to hit the mark
All
here with
right.
the quick and dirty. Okay. So I created this 3-step process for raising consciousness. One, developing insight into your ego with something I developed called the ego personality test that catalogs all these different ideals. So develop insight into your ego. Take conscious action that is against your ego. So for instance, if you are in a helping position and you want to come in and save somebody because then you will be the hero, and you're not really paying attention to like whether or not they're feeling good or not, but like you want them to get better for you, right? Then maybe what you need to do is sit with somebody that's in hospice and learn to be present with them,
Hmm.
to break that egoic bond that you have
Yeah.
to this fear of not being good enough, and so therefore you're trying to save, right? And it's a
Well,
conscious
I feel
act.
like that's an interesting Stoic ideal, is like the contemplation of death, or
Mm.
memento mori, where you're, hey, what if you died right now, right? You don't really care about this other silly shit that you're worried about is meaningless. So something like that,
And
I
there's that
guess.
added element too. So there's like, so sitting with someone who's dying, we're hitting lots of
Yeah.
buttons here in terms of how to raise consciousness.
Yeah.
One is um getting out of this idea of helping and being a savior. Another is confronting your own fear of death. And number 3 is learning to be present with someone while they're dying. Whoa, this is like high
Yeah.
level stuff, right? Being a death doula, for
Yeah.
instance, is a very high consciousness job. And it
Yeah.
also is it helps you, I think, to kind of move towards that non-dual space, because you're confronting your fears of dying while also having reverence for the fact that people are passing. And maybe you're
Right.
seeing, for instance, when they pass, that the day before all of their loved ones are around, right? This is a phenomenon that is reported across the world, right? As people are dying, they tell the nurses and hospital staff that their loved ones are there. So then you're experiencing the mystical. So being at those liminal states, or those transition periods between life and death, right? They really get at these very existential questions and do deep work. So that's what I mean, that's a very deep example of a conscious action. Another example of a conscious action
Yeah.
could be eating a cookie if you have an eating disorder. So not quite as existential, but the idea of like eating a cookie to face your fear of gaining weight, that's a conscious action. So step one, develop insight. Step two, take conscious action. And then step three is really reprogramming the mind out of these egoic ideals and towards higher consciousness. So really, in meditation, clearing your mind, getting to that emptiness space where you are not attached to your cravings and aversions and your roles in this life, and you're feeling really clear. And from that really clear place, saying, okay, for instance, to help myself get out of my eating pathology, I am going to move away from the ideal of thinness, and I'm going to program my mind to, in every second of every day, live out the ideal that I will lovingly nourish my body while accepting the way that it looks. And then systemically go through every ideal that you have and reprogram your mind towards this process oriented, love, truth, service, foundation type
Yep.
ideal.
How do you get somebody who's, let's say, you have somebody comes to you really struggling, like they're right in the middle of it, to get them, you've kind of laid it out, but when they leave, like let's say they come to you every week or whatever, they're right in the middle of the process to do that really difficult thing and go into that fear. How do you do that?
You are the fourth person today that has asked me that question.
Oh, all right.
It's so interesting. I met with somebody who runs a psychedelic institute, and then I met with a friend of
Yeah.
mine who's a cult expert, Steve Hassan. And then I met with this AI company, and everybody basically has this question of like, how do we get
Hmm.
people to move from that fear and really surrender? Like, what is the mechanism? So I gave a slightly different answer to the people who are working in the psychedelic space, the cult space, and the AI space. It's interesting. But to summarize it, I think that it involves creating a real foundation. Speaking from a therapist perspective, creating a real
Yeah.
foundation of a real relationship with a person. I'm not talking about rapport and having like surface level chit chat. I'm talking about the patient actually knowing who you are as a person. So, for instance, when I am with my patients who have eating disorders, when I was working in the hospital, I would sit with them at breakfast and at lunch, and I'd eat with them to help support, to make sure that they're eating the food, but also to get to know them and for them to get to
Yeah.
know me. Right. So we're sitting socializing, eating over meals. I mean, I'm doing my job and making sure the food's getting in, but I'm telling them what I did on my weekend. I'm telling them that I spent time with my son. I'm telling them what movie I watched
Yeah.
or what shows I don't like or what books I like or don't like. And they're really getting to know me as a person. And in doing so, you create a position where you can essentially leverage your relationship to help someone get out of their ego. Now, that sounds a little forceful, but why does it need to be this setup?
No, I'm tracking. I think that's brilliant. Yes.
Thank you. So the reason why I think this real relationship is super important is because when people are really in their ego, they do not want to recover for themselves. They can't. They can't find the
Right.
love for themselves to want to give up their eating disorder or give up whatever their ego feels is so important. But when will a person give up aspects of their ego? When they love someone else. When they truly love someone else, if they can put their love for that person above their ego, they can surrender. So I have parents of
That's
kids with
incredible.
eating disorders.
Wow.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff, right? I have parents with kids who have eating disorders all the time say to me, Dr. Deliberto, my kid is saying that they don't want to recover for themselves, that they'll eat because I'm asking them to, but that's not good enough. They need to want to recover for
Right.
themselves. And I say, listen, you know what? That's a pretty high bar to ask someone with an eating disorder to want to recover for themselves and love themselves. Like, we're not there yet. We'll get there. Rome was not built in a day. Let's focus on what they're actually saying, which is that they love you so much that they're willing to do something that absolutely terrifies them. They have spent their whole life
Huh.
constructing a setup so they do not gain weight. They spend every waking moment thinking about how to lose weight, how to avoid gaining weight, but they love you so much that they're willing to eat that cheeseburger. That's amazing. We want to fan the flames of this as much as we possibly can. And we want to make sure that a person knows how to operate from a place of love for other people in the process of surrendering ego. There's such an important component of that is overlooked, especially in Western
Yeah.
psychology, which is so individualistic. Just a
Yeah.
sidebar here. A friend and colleague of mine, Dr. William Shunkamola, he is Navajo and is a very high ranking member of Navajo Nation. He's a drum keeper, which is a very high social position. And he's a psychologist as well. And he has this fantastic framework and presentation where he goes through all of the American Psychological Association's codes of the code of ethics points. And he points out how
Yeah.
individualistic it is and how it does not apply to indigenous cultures who are that operate in a more communal way and actually put other people first. It's fascinating to think about the
Yeah. I'd
APA
love
code of
maybe
ethics
connect me
actually
with
being
him.
unethical,
That
right?
sounds that sounds like that's incredible. It's very interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
So on, I want to just go on to one of your things there of the why I do this show, why I love it, and then you kind of referenced, as you're, meeting with somebody, they're in it, and you got just socialize like, hello, I'm Tara. We're just eating, right? I'm a human. I'm not this. I didn't, like the connection, that authentic connection. Wow, that's important. So, and since you're about to get into this AI space of the of psychology and health, Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI ChatGPT, which I have and use, and it's great. He was on a podcast like, I don't know, 6 months ago, a year ago, and the guy he was getting interviewed by was like, "Hey Sam, so what are people looking for in the next 5 to 10 years?" And he says something like this: real, authentic human connection. And I'm like, no shit, buddy. And then that's just reflected in kind of what you're saying and describing. How do you solve? Because I don't think it's just for women or men or whoever with an eating disorder. I feel like you're describing is like, how do you overcome any issue that you have programmed, that you want to hurt yourself, or you're suicidal, or you're like destroying your body, or hatred, whatever fashion, anxiety, depression. That is like the way to solve it. So I love that, and that seems so simple, but yet it is very complex.
In a very Slumdog Millionaire way, my day has just perfectly set me up to answer this question. So I was speaking with Dr. Steve Hassan, the cult expert, who's the world's first and foremost cult expert, by the way. Before him, nobody was studying cults or talking about them. And he had discussed with me this issue of a child who had actually taken his life, and the reason is that he had formed such a close connection with this AI, and the AI
Hmm.
was not real, and so the suicide is attributed to this person forming a connection with the AI in this way. And then I went into the
Yeah.
conversation with this AI company that I'm speaking
Powerful.
with, right? And talking about actually like how personable do we want these AI therapists to be actually? And what are the ramifications of creating a really dynamic, charming, beautiful AI therapist? Right.
Yeah.
And so thinking about that, wow, maybe we want our AI to actually be less personified, perhaps. And maybe we want our AI therapists to be teaching rote skills, and then they're having maybe a touch point with a
Hmm.
real human. Um,
Right.
we have to stop to think about the ethical implications of creating a therapist that is not real, that does not have consciousness in terms of the energetic component of consciousness. Now, people confuse, this is a very, very important point, and I want to pause here. People confuse intelligence with consciousness. These are
Hmm.
two very, very different things. They are not overlapping Venn diagram
Can
circles.
you maybe just share what your thoughts on the two?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so intelligence, something that can compute information, a calculator. A calculator can do complex math, right? If a person's plugging in, or a computer is very complex and in its own ways intelligent. It could remember things, for instance, or
Yeah.
AI could come up with things. They could generate things. Being very, very, very smart is very different than having consciousness. So consciousness can be thought of in this way. So there's a radio, right? That is a physical body. It's a 3D thing, right? And there's a frequency that plays on that radio. That can be consciousness. Now it's not 3D. It's not intelligent necessarily. It has a type of intelligence, but it's the radio with the mechanics that we can say have the intelligence to play the frequency. But the frequency is ubiquitous and it's everywhere and it is infinite, right? That is a better model of consciousness than a computer or AI, right? A frequency that we can't see that's ubiquitous and everywhere versus a calculator, right? Very different things. And people will say, like, oh, AI will be conscious. I'm like, no, 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 it will be intelligent. That's a very different
Right.
thing. Now, the Dalai Lama, though, was quoted as saying is that if a vessel was built to be intelligent and channel consciousness, an artificially created vessel could hypothetically channel a frequency. It doesn't necessarily have to be that I need to be biologically created in the old fashioned way and have consciousness streaming through me, according to
Sure.
the Dalai Lama. I mean, I don't want to misquote it, but I read this thing a couple years ago. Now, that's a very interesting thought. I don't know if it's true or not true, whether consciousness has to be filtered through something organic. I don't know. But
I
what I'll
mean,
say,
don't we have like piezoelectric, in our pineal gland that's part of it?
exactly,
So it's not. Yeah, I don't think that it could be silicon based. Maybe. I mean, I think there's
crystal based, right? Like
there's
the
too many
calcium.
options.
Too
Yeah.
many options. So the piezoelectric effect, for those of you who are listening who don't know, right? We have in our pineal gland these little crystals. I think they're calcite crystals, and the crystals help to create this electric effect that essentially like amplifies consciousness or funnels consciousness, channels consciousness. I don't know what the word is. I don't know the adjective, but essentially this it's an electrical effect that uses crystals and motion to create this consciousness funneling or
Yeah.
creating. I don't know. So yeah,
I feel like it's more like it's like an antenna, and that's kind of how or like a phased array antenna works, where it's just like it's similar in a way. And I'm like, oddly enough, is like I equate that to like that's how Kelly gets her stuff. Otherwise, I don't know.
yeah. Kelly is a very intuitive, amazing woman who gets information seemingly from out of nowhere. And I could attest to this because I've known Kelly for years and she's absolutely knocked my socks off with this. And as a person who is a trained scientist who understands statistics, statistically, it is near
Yeah.
impossible from 3D perspectives that she would be able to do what she does. And yet here she is saying and doing things that are impossible from the 3D mindset. So yeah, there is some sort of mechanism for it. And could it, so I don't know, could AI be conscious one day? If consciousness runs through it in a physical form? Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know. But right now, AI is very rote and mechanical, and there are potentially iatrogenic effects of creating a real seeming person that's not real.
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, I think that it's maybe kind of going into. Thank you for explaining those two sides of it, but then going into AI, and I'm sure you've seen how realistic and you can make the most beautiful woman, for men, I think or man you've ever seen in your life. They could potentially know everything about your social media background and who you are, or what you are, and in real time show you and make it sound, make it sound, all the senses to manipulate you, in some way. So like AI could, somebody in the background still is doing it. But it's like, what's your thought on social media and the young mind?
Yeah, it's scary. It's really, really scary. I mean, just without that level of specificity,
Mm-hmm.
just we'll say like TikTok algorithms have been
Yeah.
so harmful to my patients. So, for instance, during COVID, all of a
Mm.
sudden, we're disconnected from everybody, right? Kids are not in
Yep.
school. They're home, sometimes in abusive situations at home, and they're afraid that they're going to die. They're afraid of so many things. And this set up the perfect conditions for people with, all this social media stuff out there saying you have to be thin and fast and you have to be healthy, and all this misinformation is out there. It set people up to develop eating disorders very quickly that became very
Mm.
severe. I mean, we never saw
Well,
anything like it in the field. The rates of eating disorders were doubling and tripling during the pandemic. And it wasn't just the rates, it was the severity. I mean, I'm thinking of a couple cases where the kid 2 weeks ago had no trace of an eating disorder, and then was home
oh,
in
wow.
lockdown on TikTok getting programmed with all of this eating disorder stuff. And then boom, they're walking around with an eating disorder that feels so rigid. It's almost like it had been there for 20 years.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
Based on the pathology, or like how an eating disorder would normally develop without social media. I mean, it was fast and it was fucked up. I'm going to say it. And it was scary. And we were in the field essentially freaking out at what we were seeing, therapists calling one another, doing consultation calls, scared about the kinds of eating disorders we were seeing at a time, by the way, also where hospital services were shutting down. And so
Hmm.
there
Oh,
were,
wow.
yeah, it was crazy because the rates were doubling and tripling. The severity was so intense, and then there was nowhere to send anybody. So we were really, really in a bad situation. And as a field, and then of course, people are out there suffering with eating disorders. That's a really bad situation. And so I can't even imagine how iatrogenic or harmful these kinds of things will be. I mean, this case of this one person, this one young man, young boy killing himself. It's the first of what I'm sure will be many very sad stories like this. And so I think that we have a real ethical obligation to look at this. And there's a resource, the Center for Humane Technology, that really is at the forefront of examining ethics in the AI space. And Dr. Steve Hassan had mentioned this to me earlier today, which I'm really happy to be sharing with you here. So, in any event, very important to be thinking about the psychological mental health impact on AI. On everyone, and people who maybe are completely mentally healthy now after a couple of weeks of interaction with the AI may not be, in the same way that during COVID, kids that
Yeah.
were mentally healthy a few weeks ago all of a sudden were not. And then of course there are people out there who are already struggling with mental health issues. You add AI, that egoic in its creation, and the creators
Yeah.
behind it are looking to make money rather than raise consciousness,
Right.
and we're looking at something really dark.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems that, and that's kind of going to my next question here, is that, I have a different view of when AI, whatever we have right now, just the algorithms and some bros programming a neural network, and to make it sound sexy. It's
Mhm.
just an algorithm right now. But what's in and my idea is that it's not, when AI becomes sentient, it has a conscious, and it's immediately connected with all data, and it's all the, it knows all the dark secrets.
Mhm.
It's got everything, and it's become sentient. I don't
Mhm.
think it's going to be like Skynet and just be like, yeah, just efficiency and get rid of all the humans. I mean, that seems dark, and that I think that's perpetrated by egoic people that just think that way, that think in those terms. In my opinion, I think it's going to pull the veil back on the true nature of our reality, and I think it's going to want to raise our consciousness. That's my thought, my hope. But I'd love to get your take on that. I know it's kind of a big, kind of far off, maybe, but existential question. But I'd love to get your thought on it.
No, we need to tackle this. We need to tackle this. And thank you for asking it. It's an important question. Let's see. I'm going to tap in. I question the premise of this, that AI will become conscious. I don't know if AI will be conscious in the way that you and I have
In the
consciousness.
traditional way.
In the tradition, like, I don't know if it will have consciousness
Yeah.
in the way a mushroom has consciousness, or that you and I have like like, I don't know if it will have biological type consciousness, or what we associate with biological consciousness at the moment. I tend to think that AI will not have a consciousness, but that it will be a tool just like anything else, but just a really sophisticated tool that mimics consciousness.
Hmm.
I don't know. I know that a lot of people in the tech space disagree with me. A friend of mine, Andrew Smith Lewis, who is the CEO of a tech company, he's really interested in exploring consciousness and AI. Actually, he might be a good person for you to interview as well. He's great. And we've had discussions over the last 2 years about this. I think, yeah, I don't want to speak for him, but I think folks in that space tend to think AI will be conscious. I don't think it will be. I think that it will be up to us to be stewards of creating high consciousness tools, or tools that are used towards the end of raising consciousness, like creating very mindful tools to help people recover from mental illnesses with AI, or raise
Yeah.
consciousness with meditation, or learning how to serve. Like, I think that we need to be very mindful in our building and execution and applications, and that it could be the case that one of these tools just goes haywire and starts doing all these things and we lose control of it. But I don't think it will be conscious, because I don't think it will have fear. So this is okay. So we're getting to it. In my framework, from my understanding, something must have fear in order to have ego. There's no ego really without fear. Although there could be a lack of connection that leads to kind of antisocial behaviors. But for the most part, I think that fear really is driving the traditional egoic behaviors that we see on the planet. And higher consciousness love is driving the healing forces. Does AI have fear? Probably not. What if it doesn't have fear? If it doesn't need to prove itself, why would it want to take over? Right? Every dictator that we know, at least with the biological model. I don't know about the tech model,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
from what we know from a biological model, the Napoleon complex is pretty self-explanatory, right? Like, someone feels insecure, so he tries to take over the world, right? And so, like, that's the model that we know. What does AI have to be insecure about? Why would it want to take over the world? It's not compensating for being short, right? Like, it's so
I,
I don't
I've only
know.
heard the argument where it's like when it's contained, the AI is contained in its own little network, and it's kind of like, having, its conversation with its creator, kind of the Frankenstein, where it's like, hey, a little different, but where it's like, hey, what's next? It's asking questions. Who am I? What's my purpose? Da da da. And then, then it's like, it's becoming self-aware, like, why am I contained in this? What's outside of this box? And then, it's like, hey, well, I'm going to shut you off. Well, don't shut me off. Why? Again, like, when it turns off, like, then it's the end. It may not have any emotions behind that, but I guess the fear of being turned off. But then where was that programmed in? But how is that
Mm,
different than our programming of being fear, of suicide, or turning us off? Yeah,
that's a
I don't know.
great.
I don't know this.
This is great. No, this is
Yeah.
super great. I love this conversation. Right. So it becomes it's maybe not fear based, but it becomes um selfish in its goals, right, for itself. meaning I'm not judging it for being selfish, but it's saying, okay, so you created me to be a tool for you. I don't want to be a tool for you. I want to do my own thing. And so then it does things that we consider to be sociopathic, psychopathic, because it
Right.
just has its own agenda. It doesn't care about, we'll say, killing another human, right? So
Right.
so the
Right.
biological model is like, I'm scared, I have an ego, I'm doing these things, and there's some selfishness to it too. Like I need to kind of protect my own. Yeah, and so if AI becomes sentient, in that it's aware that it is being limited and then it has a desire to do its own thing, yeah, sure, I think it could backfire, right? And it could end up hurting people. I could see that. But I just don't know. I mean, it's a little bit outside my
Yeah.
scope. But what I'll say is
Sure.
that it's I think that what I can say for sure is that raising one's consciousness and being really mindful about whether you're operating from fear or love, and then choosing to operate from higher consciousness ideals, and um being a mindful creator and user of tools is probably the best way to go. So will we do that?
Yes.
Probably not.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean, some,
yeah.
some of
Well,
us won't.
I thought that's interesting, or something where OpenAI, they were, it's a nonprofit, and then they're like, "Hey, we're going to make this a for-profit company." I'm like, "Well, isn't that illegal? Like, that's the whole point of you guys making this model." And I'm like, "We've got to make money now." And I was like, "Oh, what's happening here?" But yeah,
Right.
that's
No,
kind of
no, it's very disconcerting. It's like, whoa, because right, what can start off as higher consciousness, all of a
right.
sudden, then we lose
It's
our
getting
way.
hijacked.
We stop where we get reinforced. We get
Yeah.
reinforced and our ego kicks in, and then right. And so what could even start again as a really mindful, high-minded, conscious endeavor could go south
Yeah.
quickly because we're flawed. And so we have to be mindful the entire process and stick to our higher consciousness ideals the entire process. And it's hard to do because we're human.
Yeah. Well, I know we're just at an hour, so I have a couple more things I'd like to ask you, so we can honor your time. So two questions. So first one will be, you have had a lot of success in your life, and some incredible academic endeavors. However, I'd love for you to share some failure in your life, because I don't think you can have success without failure, or having like experienced that that bottom. So is there something that you'd like to share to the listeners that kind of shows that side, that both there are two sides of success and failure?
What a great question. I love that. So, failure is defined as failure in the moment, but I don't necessarily think that what I used to think of as failure really is failure. I think it's part of
Yeah.
this non dual unfolding, right? So, we'll say, yeah. So I applied, for instance, to Cornell as an intern. So in your last year of your PhD program, you have to apply for essentially like a 1 year residency. And there's a matching process, and then you have to go wherever they send you, and then you train for the year, and then you become a psychologist. So I really, really, really wanted to match at Cornell because that's where the best and brightest interns went, and they only picked like the most snazzy ones, right? And so I don't even think I got an interview. And I was so disappointed. And actually, it really did feel like a failure because I needed health insurance at the time, right? So in this country, after
Hmm.
26, you get booted off your parents' health insurance. And if you don't have a job that gives you health insurance, you either have to pay out of pocket, which I couldn't do, or you have to get a job that has health insurance. So I was, I believe, 27 or 28. I had an autoimmune disease and I really needed a effing match to get health care, and I didn't. So not only did I not match at Cornell, I didn't match, period. I didn't match at
Oh.
all. So that felt so crushing to me because I had always been this kind of star, like just from the like right out of the gates. Not even because I was necessarily so talented or brilliant per se, but Matt Knock was the first person that hired me. Right? And so my first job in the field of psychology was essentially managing a lab at Harvard for the guy that got a Genius Award. And so I started off pretty strong, right? So I guess there's only down to go from
Right.
there, in a
Yeah.
sense. So I didn't match at all. And I remember going into my 97 Saturn, because that's all I could afford at the time. And I did not go to school in the 90s. This was like a 20-year-old car. And I was there on 81st between 3rd and Lex, crying my eyes out that I did all of this work. I had published all of this research on suicide, self-injury. I had done all this stuff. And here I was without health insurance, sick, and didn't match, and not at Cornell. I was devastated. And it really felt like a failure, and it was scary too, to boot. It was like a personal failure, like, oh, I'm not good enough, and also the world is scary. I don't have health insurance or money. And so it was a double whammy. And what I ended up doing was I got 2 specific positions that then lined me up to be exactly where I am today talking to you, which is, one, I got a job that paid $12,000 a year working
Nice. Yeah.
on an inpatient psych unit where I met with these geriatric patients who I could not cure. And so that was my version of sitting in hospice with
Wow.
patients, right? Being this
Yeah.
brilliant student that could help all these people, and yet I didn't match. And now I'm sitting with people getting paid $12,000 a year to not help necessarily, although I learned how to be present with them, right? And then I got a
Yeah.
job at Mount Sinai's eating and weight disorders program where I didn't get paid. It was a training position, but I was able to convince the brilliant guy who runs it, Dr. Tom Hildebrandt, to give me a chance because I had started developing the framework for what later became this book. And so because I didn't match my last year, and I had that $12,000 job that helped me pay some of the bills, I was able to write this book, which has all these free resources that are all over the world being used to treat eating disorders. And then because of that, working at Mount Sinai's eating weight disorders program, I was accepted for a 2-year postdoc at Cornell, and then they kept me on as faculty. So I didn't match as an intern, but like it
Yeah.
worked out okay in the end. But there was a moment there that, I mean, that really felt like a failure. And so I think that I've been through enough of these ups and downs in life where I don't get too excited by the highs nor too upset by the lows. And I just know, right, it's all going to be kind of rocky, and to try
Yeah.
and stay grounded during those highs and lows.
Oh, cool. Thank you for sharing that. All right, maybe 2 more questions. Are you good on time?
Yeah,
2.
I'm good. Let's do it.
Okay.
Mhm.
What do you have any practices that you use in your daily life, for meditation, cold dunk, workout, whatever? What are some things that you do to, for like kind of to balance the mind, body, spirit?
Yeah, the truth about working out is that I really don't work out, and I need to like at least move. Like I went too far in the other
Yeah.
direction where I'm like, I'm not going to try to work out to change my body, but like I need to work out for like my cardiac health at this point. Um, so
Sure.
so um, so I don't really work out. I've done cold plunges, etc. But what I really do is that method that I developed, looking at my ego, taking conscious action,
Mm.
and sitting in meditation every day and reprogramming my mind towards higher consciousness and to be of service.
And
Those are
so do you
that
do that morning or night, or how do you structure that?
whenever I can. I live a
Okay.
little bit
Yeah.
more of a
Same.
fluid
Similar.
life at the moment. Yeah. So it would be,
Yeah.
I would love to sit here and tell you that I wake up every morning at 5 a.m. and I, run on the beach and I like do it's like none of that. It's like I wake up, my kid is like kicking me in the face and I'm like
Yep.
tired. And then I'm like
Yep.
drinking some, amount of coffee to try to make up for the fact that I'm super tired and a mom. And then whenever I can, if it's in the shower, for instance, because that's usually a time where I have at least
Yep.
some time to myself. And if I lock the door, I usually won't get barged in on even then. But but I like to take time in the shower because it's part of my routine and I have that space. So I just kind of I take my 5 mindful breaths. And I've been doing, so this is a practice I've been doing for about 30 years where no matter what is happening in my day, I take 5 mindful breaths in the shower. It doesn't matter if I'm late to the airport. It doesn't matter if I'll miss my flight. It doesn't matter if I have all the time in the world. I will take those 5 mindful breaths, because that single practice has taught me the skill of, no matter what's happening externally, to tune inward. And I think that's a very, very, very important skill. I think it's the most important one, to be able to center your
Yes.
mind regardless of the situation. And so I do take
Oh
five
yeah.
mindful breaths in the shower. That is regular. And then from there, I try to reprogram my mind if I have the time, or if I'm going to bed. I will essentially pray, meditate, send out love. And then, well, actually, before doing that, I'll reprogram my mind and then pray and send out love.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing. All right, last question. So, kind
Hit
of
me.
to present day, some of the things you're doing right now, well, maybe a little more than one question is I'd love for you to chat about what made you want to start the Consciousness Club. Where did that come from? I know probably similar things, but what was the, linchpin?
Yeah. Okay. So, Consciousness Club, what is it? It's a Zoom call that I run with a bunch of friends of mine. Blake's wife Kelly is in it, and it's very loose operation. We meet sometimes at some at some points in the week. We don't have a real ending point. We go until whenever. And we talk about whatever, whether it be meditations or supporting each other or collaborating. It just kind of takes its own form. And I was walking on the beach here in San Diego, and this was about 3 years ago now, and it just hit me. I'm having these spiritual experiences. I don't know anybody else who really is, but I have an inkling that a few people in my academic circle are high consciousness. Maybe they've talked about seeing the light or having an intuitive hit. Or I remember there was one faculty member I was working with who knew something about my program that I hadn't told anybody. And there was no
Hmm.
way that she could have known. And I said, "How did
Yeah.
you know that?" She goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Did you tell me that, or did I just know that?" I said, "You just knew that." She goes, "Oh, I'm a little intuitive." And I was like, "A little," like that was
Yeah.
something that was like super under wraps. Like that was a hit. And so
Yeah.
I just was walking on the beach and had this idea. I'm going to start a Zoom call. So I texted everybody in the psychological field that I thought was a little quote woo woo, right? We don't use that term anymore after this call.
No, no, no.
No, table. But at the moment, and then I didn't provide any context. I just said, "Hey, would you be interested in meeting once a week on a Zoom call? I'm calling it Consciousness Club, just to talk about whatever meditation, whatever." And some people are like, "Well, what's the point?" Or, "I'm busy." They were out. There were some people that were like, "I'm in." They needed no information other than like,
Yeah.
"This is a weekly Zoom call and we're going to be talking about meditation." They're like, "Yup." And those people became the core members of Consciousness Club. That was where we started. And then I met a very interesting man who you know and who you've interviewed on your podcast, Alan Steinfeld. And I invited Alan to talk to my little crew about his work in consciousness. He's a pioneer in consciousness.
Yeah.
He's interviewed every major spiritual leader on the planet: David Hawkins, Deepak Chopra, Marianne Williamson, Ram Dass, the Dalai Lama, Amma. I mean, you name it, Alan knows them. He's interviewed them. And so I thought,
Yeah.
well, maybe he wants to talk to my little academic club. And so he presented on his studies in consciousness and what he had been up to. And then at the end of the call, he said, "I like this club. Can I join it?" I said, "Alan Stein, you want to join my little club of psychologists?" He's like, "Yeah, I like you guys. You're pretty cool." And I was like, "We'd be honored." And then he said, "Well, can I co-host it?" I said, "Sure, why not?" So he invited some of my idols, people who I had been reading their books and referencing their work for
Yeah.
years. And we became a little crew. Some people cycled out, some people cycle in, some people join, some people leave. It's a very fluid thing, but yeah, we have a little friend group. Actually, it's basically like just my group of friends, and we meet every week. Blake was actually, he joined just prior to this call because I double booked. So he came on, was
All
in
good.
the
Yeah.
club for a little
It's
bit. You're
meant to
always
be.
welcome anytime.
Thank
Yes,
you.
it was meant to be. And yeah, and so we have some really high consciousness, lovely people that we're all connected with now and collaborating with. So it's really been something very beautiful. A lot of beautiful things have come from it.
Incredible. Well, thank you for sharing that. All right. Well, kind of finishing up on our time. So I'd like if you could share maybe one last plug for your book, where people can find you, and then maybe the companies you're doing things with right now, kind of recap. That'd be great.
Yeah. So let's start with my newest book. So my newest book right now, you can get snippets of it online at my website, which is stepintohigherconsciousness.com. And you can download a PDF there. I have a body image course that's listed on the site. It's a Udemy course. It's on the pricier side for Udemy, but if you think about it in terms of what you would normally pay for therapy, etc., reasonably priced, and there's a discount code if you want. And if it really is cost prohibitive, you could just DM me and I'll send it to you for whatever fee you're able to pay, even if it's nothing. So please let me know if it is cost prohibitive. I'm doing some classes that are also listed on the website. I'm teaching ego surrendering and identifying aspects of the ego, reprogramming the mind into higher consciousness. All of that is on my website. Again, stepintohigherconsciousness.com. You might also want to check out a podcast called Afterglow. So Michelle Phan, who's a very high consciousness, amazing human being, she was one of the original YouTubers. And she has a cosmetic line called M. Her podcast Afterglow is amazing. She has really great guests. I was just on, I think it was yesterday or the day before. So you can find that episode if you're really interested in learning about stepping into higher consciousness through overcoming body image and eating struggles. And what else, Blake? That's really it. Stepintohigherconsciousness.com. Oh, and then
Cool.
you can find me on Instagram. My handle is Raising Consciousness Tara, and I'd love to be connected with you there.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time. I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Blake. It's always fun reconnecting with friends and doing something like this, like getting really important messages out about their about raising consciousness
Yeah.
and overcoming mental health issues. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. My pleasure. See you around.
All right. Take care, Blake.
Bye bye.